There's a handcrafted cedar popper lure sitting on my desk right now, and inside its hollow body, I once hid the only surviving copy of a partnership contract that my own son tried to erase. That lure didn't just save me from financial ruin. It handed me back everything he stole, and now he spends every workday assembling tackle boxes in a vest that reads, "Hooked on Lies," while every lure we ship carries his federal fraud docket number on the packaging. This is the story of how I went from a betrayed widow with an empty IRA to the owner of a company where my son works for me, publicly branded as a con man. My name is Elaine, and I never thought I'd be telling this story at 62 years old. My husband Thomas died 3 years ago after a short, brutal fight with lung cancer that took him in 4 months flat. He left me a widow's IRA that he'd carefully built over 35 years as a master locksmith, a trade he loved so much that he taught me the basics on rainy Sunday afternoons in our garage, with a practice cylinder mounted to a wooden board and a leatherette case of picks he kept oiled like surgical instruments. He also left me his quiet warnings about our son Lucas, who was gifted at talking people into things but allergic to actual work. Thomas used to say, "That boy could sell ice to a snowman, but he'll melt as soon as the sun comes out. If you ever pour your retirement into one of his big ideas, you'll end up broke and bitter, and I won't be there to pick the lock for you." I was too full of a mother's hope to listen. I had spent decades as an ICU nurse, reading monitors and titrating drips, but my real passion was handcrafting vintage base lures from tight-grained western red cedar and balsa, sanding them with 220 grit until they felt like silk, then airbrushing scale patterns in transparent layers to mimic the exact forage of shad and bluegill in different water clarities. I'd been doing it since I was a girl, taught by my own father who ran a tackle shop on Lake Fork, where I spent summers weighing live shiners and studying the shimmer of threadfin. After Thomas passed, Lucas showed up at my door with a slick presentation on his tablet, promising we could turn my hobby into a real legacy business for my grandson Leo, who was then only 5 and already obsessed with casting a tiny Zebco at the neighborhood pond alongside his Grammy. I drained that entire IRA, all $105,000, and we co-founded Legacy Lure Company as an LLC with me holding 60% ownership as the investor and head lure designer, Lucas holding 40% as the managing partner. We notarized a detailed operating agreement that I insisted on keeping myself, and at Thomas's old suggestion, I tucked it inside a hollow wooden base lure he had carved for me years ago, a 6-inch popper in a threadfin shad pattern with a threaded brass nose cone that unscrewed to reveal a waterproof storage tube lined with a thin sleeve of surgical latex. That lure held the only original notarized copy, the one with genuine ink signatures and the embossed seal of Notary Public Bonnie Trask, a silver-haired friend of Thomas's who had known us for decades and who had stamped her seal into the wet ink while Thomas's oxygen concentrator hummed in the corner of the living room. The business caught fire faster than I expected. My hand-tied feathered trebles, each skirt of bucktail and flashaboo tied with a whip-finish knot I'd practiced until my fingers cramped, and my detailed scale patterns, layered with transparent Createx paints and sealed with a 2-part epoxy that had to cure on a wheel for 18 hours, attracted serious base anglers. Within 2 years, a national outdoor retailer called Ridgeline Outfitters came calling. Their merchandise director, a man named Robert Chen who fished the base circuit on weekends, offered $590,000 for our entire inventory of over 4,000 handcrafted lures, plus an exclusive licensing deal on my top 12 designs. I nearly wept when I heard the number. It was supposed to be my safe harbor, a way to leave something behind for Leo and to retire without being a burden on anyone. Lucas handled all the paperwork while I was at a fishing expo in Dallas, a 3-day event where I demoed my airbrushing technique and signed lures for a line that stretched around the booth. He called me every night with updates, his voice smooth and reassuring, saying the deal was clean and almost closed, and that Robert even wanted to feature me in a catalog spread as the matriarch of modern handcrafted lures. I drove home a day early, exhausted and smelling of paint thinner, and found a thick courier envelope wedged under my doormat, already soaked from a brief downpour. Inside was a cashier's check for $590,000 made out to something called Lucas Tackle Holdings, LLC, and a cover letter thanking Lucas for the acquisition. My hands started shaking so hard the wet paper tore at the edge. I called Lucas, who arrived within an hour with his wife Bianca, a woman who treated Instagram captions like they were legally binding contracts, and drove an Audi SUV that still smelled of new leather and entitlement, her blonde hair curled into perfect spirals. Lucas set a document in front of me on the kitchen table. The title read, Voluntary Dissolution of Legacy Lure Company, LLC. It bore my signature, notarized. Dated 6 weeks earlier on a Tuesday, I had spent at a doctor's appointment for my thyroid. I had never seen it. The signature was a crude imitation, the loop on my E missing its characteristic forward kick, the ink too thick where my hand would have dragged finer. He said, "Mom, you agreed to step down, remember? You told me you were too old for the stress and wanted me to handle the sales solo. We dissolved the old entity, and I formed a clean new one for the acquisition. It's standard business. Robert's team even recommended it." Then he placed a yellow plastic tackle box beside the document. It smelled of stale plastic and cheap foam that had begun to degrade into a sticky residue. Inside, a layer of Veller held $3,800 in mixed 20s and 50s, as if he'd raided a cash drawer. "Consider it your buyout," he said, his voice dropping the false cheer. "That's more than your stake was worth, honestly. We're moving you into our guest suite this weekend so we can look after you. Bianca already arranged a home health aide who can handle your medications." Bianca nodded, holding up her phone as if to capture my grateful reaction for her stories. She said, "We only want what's best for you, Elaine. You've been so forgetful lately. Remember last week when you couldn't find your keys? And the time you left the stove on? I hadn't been forgetful. I had a clear mind and a sharp tongue, but grief had hollowed me enough that they assumed I'd crumple, and I could replay the key incident. I'd purposely left my keys hanging in the door after a long day, a small test I'd read about in a nursing journal for early cognitive screening, but they'd twisted it. They immediately began packing up my hallway workshop, a converted sunroom filled with decades of tools and prototypes, racks of carved blanks, jars of custom paint mixes, a ventilation hood I'd installed myself. Lucas started tossing fishing artifacts into heavy-duty black trash bags. He grabbed my father's old wooden tackle box, a battered mahogany case with brass corners and a false bottom panel that only lifted if you pressed a specific knot in the grain, and dropped it into a bag with a sneer. "Junk," he said. "Nobody wants this dusty stuff. We'll get you a new organizer from the container store." They left an hour later, and I was supposed to follow them in Bianca's car the next day, my suitcase already packed with only a few changes of clothes, as if I were being admitted to an institution. That night, with rain lashing against the windows in cold sheets, I dug the tackle box out of the trash bag, my fingers trembling not from age, but from a flood of adrenaline that left my chest tight. I knew its secret compartment well. My father had shown it to me when I was 9, a hidden latch under the tray that caught on a steel spring. I released it and lifted the false bottom. There, nestled in a velvet cutout that had once held my father's prized tournament medal, was the cedar popper lure with the threaded brass nose cone. I unscrewed it with my thumb, the faint scent of cedar oil still trapped inside that little cylinder, and pulled out a tightly rolled cylinder of paper held with simple kitchen twine. Unfurled, it was the original notarized operating agreement, 60% ownership in my name, a clause that no sale of the company's intellectual property could occur without the notarized signatures of both members witnessed together, and a dissolution clause requiring identical co-signing. A second slip of paper, yellowed with age and textured like parchment, was tucked inside. Thomas had written in his blocky draftsman's hand, his letters square and perfectly aligned. "If you're reading this, Lucas has already betrayed you. This contract voids anything he has forged. Trust Bonnie's notary seal, not his words. I love you, Elaine. Remember that a lock only keeps out those who don't know the combination. You know it." The date was 3 months before his death. He had known even then that our son might someday try to cut me out, and he'd left me the key in more ways than one. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that a mother's sacrifice should never become a child's free handout. Now back to what happened next. Lucas and Bianca moved me into their guest suite that Saturday, presenting it as a generous invitation. The room was painted a sterile top that matched a model home, and it had a motion sensor in the hallway that chirped every time I left my bed, the sound like a digital cricket. They told me it was for my safety, in case I fell at night, but I recognized the pattern from my nursing years. It was a perimeter alarm for a patient they intended to confine. Bianca handed me a laminated welcome card that listed house rules, including no cooking, no use of the washing machine alone, and a request that I keep my door open a crack at all times. She said the home health aide would start Monday. The next morning, she drafted a durable power of attorney document on her MacBook, pages of legalese that would give Lucas full control over my remaining assets, including my home, my car, a small SCP retirement account from my nursing days, and even my Social Security direct deposits. She slid it across the breakfast island with a heavy silver pen, explaining that it was purely precautionary in case my memory issues worsened. I blinked slowly, letting my gaze drift to the middle distance like a patient coming out of sedation. I said I was still too foggy from the shock of the sale, too confused to even understand the document, and needed a doctor's checkup before signing anything legal. They exchanged a glance and smiled, and Bianca patted my hand. "Of course, Elaine. We'll get you into the neurologist next week. In the meantime, just relax." I spent the next week perfecting a performance of mild cognitive decline. I misplaced the television remote twice, leaving it in the refrigerator both times. I called Bianca by the name of my deceased sister, Margaret, at dinner, and watched her lips tighten. I stared at the microwave buttons as if they were hieroglyphics, pressing random numbers until she had to come over and punch in my oatmeal time herself. I became so perfectly foggy that they treated me like furniture. They talked freely around me, taking calls on speakerphone in the kitchen while I sat in my recliner with a half-knitted scarf in my lap, needles still. They left documents half-shredded on the coffee table, a cheap shredder that only cross-cut one direction, easy to piece back together with a little tape and patience. The maid, a quiet woman named Rosa who smelled of lavender cleaner, gave me sympathetic looks but said nothing, and I later learned she was paid under the table and afraid of Bianca's temper. The red flags erupted fast. Lucas's frantic tone on the phone in his wood-paneled study slipped through the heating vents like smoke. I heard him pleading with someone about escrow on the Ridge Line deal. "I told you my mother's signature is valid. Just release the funds. The bank wants a copy of the original operating agreement from Legacy, but I can't produce it because I told them it was destroyed. Yes, I know the notary number doesn't match the county database. I'm working on it." Another call, muffled but clear enough. "No, she can't sign a ratification right now. She's not competent. I'm working on getting durable power. Just give me 2 more weeks before Red Tree starts accruing default interest." I realized the $500,000 wasn't even in his bank account yet. The retailer's legal department, doing final due diligence, had flagged the notary discrepancy and placed the sale proceeds in an escrow account at First Federal Bank, frozen pending verification of the dissolution's validity. Bianca, meanwhile, had already started a $30,000 kitchen renovation on credit, ripping out granite countertops and ordering custom cabinets, charging the deposit to a high-interest card that arrived in a glossy black envelope on the counter, the APRA 29. 99%. Lucas's spending was frantic too. His truck dealership had left a message about a skipped payment, and I found a past due notice from a hard money lender called Red Tree Capital tucked inside a drawer that had been left ajar. The notice mentioned a loan number and a principal of $200,000, with a balloon date circled in red. The breaking point came during a household chore disguised as a crisis. The guest bathroom sink developed a leak, water pooling around the pedestal and threatening the baseboard. Bianca, already running late for a Botox appointment, shoved an old plumber's number into my hand and said, "Supervise these people, will you? I can't deal with another disaster." The plumber, a gruff man named Rick, arrived with a tool belt and a plunger. He needed access to the basement to shut off the main valve because the sink's angle stop was seized with corrosion. He asked if I had a valve key. I told him I'd fetch it from the utility room, and while I was down in the cool, concrete-smelling basement, the bare bulbs swinging overhead, I noticed the door to Lucas's home office was ajar. A metal filing cabinet with a sturdy Medico lock sat in the corner, the kind with a heavy cylinder that resisted simple raking. My heartbeat accelerated. Thomas had been a master locksmith for 30 years, specializing in commercial high-security locks. And on those rainy Sundays, he taught me to pick with a practice cylinder and a small leatherette kit that I still kept in my everyday purse as a talisman. The kit contained a tension wrench of spring steel, a standard short hook, and a diamond rake, all from his workbench, each tool worn smooth by his hands. I'd last used them to open a stuck filing cabinet at the hospital a decade ago when a key had snapped. I palmed the kit from my purse, and with Rick's wet vac droning upstairs, knelt beside the filing cabinet. The Medico lock had a mushroom pin that I could feel the moment I inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway and applied light torque clockwise. The first pin set with a soft click, then the second felt mushy, a spool that required counter-rotation, a subtle feel where I had to ease the tension until the pin slipped past the false set. Thomas's voice echoed in my head. When you feel it bind, don't muscle it. That's a security pin fighting back. Let the tension tell you which way to go. I worked pin 3, a standard, then pin 4, another spool that clicked into place with a satisfying snap. The plug rotated, and the drawer slid open on smooth rails, the faint scent of manila folders and toner inkwafting out. Inside, a folder labeled Legacy Lure Dissolution held a full copy of the forged dissolution document, but it also included a promissory note from Red Tree Capital for $200,000, dated 6 months earlier. My name and social security number were listed as the personal guarantor in a line I'd never seen before. The signature was a clumsy forgery again, the tail of my Y backward, the ink visibly different from the rest of the document. Lucas had taken out a hard money loan, using my identity to fund the initial bulk inventory order of balsa and treble hooks that made the Ridge Line deal possible. A balloon payment of $218,000 was due in 22 days, and the note carried a default clause that gave the lender a lien on all business assets, including the lure designs themselves and the trade secrets behind my airbrushing stencils. Attached were photocopies of my driver's license, my social security card, his own application form where he claimed to be managing partner with full authority, and a fake notary acknowledgement bearing a stamp number that, upon quick mental cross-check with Bonnie Trask's seal on the original contract, didn't match. The expiration date on the fake notary commission was also wrong. I photographed every page with my phone, making sure to capture the paper's watermark. Then I stealthily relocked the cabinet, the Medico cylinder clicking home, and returned the key to its hiding spot on top of the doorframe where I'd seen Lucas tuck it one afternoon. I had enough evidence to hang him, but I knew I couldn't just walk into a police station with blurry phone photos and a story. I needed a legitimate authority who understood the intricate legal terrain of intellectual property, LLC governance, and identity fraud. I called Walter Simmons, the attorney who had drafted our original operating agreement and who had been Thomas's close friend since childhood, a man with a thick mustache and a habit of tapping his pen on a legal pad. We met at a diner 3 towns over, the Pancake Palace, at a corner booth under a buzzing fluorescent light. I slid the original cedar lure contract across a greasy tabletop, careful not to touch the syrup ring, along with prints of the forged promissory note. Walter's face went through 3 shades of pale before he spoke. He ordered 2 cups of black coffee and asked for no interruptions from the waitress. Then he said, "Elaine, your husband anticipated this. Before he passed, he had me draft an addendum to your operating agreement, and he filed it quietly with the county clerk as part of a separate dynasty trust for the benefit of your grandson Leo, with you as sole trustee and lifetime beneficiary. That addendum states that any dissolution of Legacy Lure Company not personally witnessed and notarized in my presence, Walter Simmons, is void ab initio, meaning from the beginning, legally it never happened. Furthermore, it automatically reassigns all intellectual property rights, your lure designs, your trade secrets, your unique painting stencils, even the name Legacy Lure, to the trust, which also places a security interest on them via a UCC-1 financing statement recorded at the state level. Lucas never discovered that filing because it was listed under a different entity name, the Thomas H. Elmore Legacy Trust, not Legacy Lure Company. Ridgeline's legal team actually discovered that filing during their lien search, which is precisely why their escrow agent froze the funds. They're insisting on a live, videotaped notarization of the dissolution by you, personally, before they'll release 1 cent. Without you, That $590,000 might as well be in a vault on the moon. My husband, the quiet locksmith who could read a cylinder with his fingertips and who always said that security was about layers, had built a dead man's switch into the very bones of the company. Without my physical, willing, and verifiable presence, the assets were legally inert, and any attempt to bypass me would trigger a cascade of trust provisions that reverted everything to me. Walter said the trust also contained a clause called a poison pill, inspired by Thomas's love of spy novels, that gave me the power to reclaim all ownership and void any transaction if any member attempted fraud. He contacted the U.S. Postal Inspection Service because mailing the forged dissolution document across state lines to Ridge Line's headquarters in Colorado and to the bank constituted mail fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1341, a felony with serious teeth. Inspector David Cross was assigned, a man in his 50s with a salt and pepper crew cut and a fondness for fishing himself. He told me later he'd once won a local tournament on a popper design similar to mine. He took immediate interest and met us at Walter's office, a paneled room with law books and a window air conditioner that rattled. They asked me to wear a recording device, a small digital necklace that looked like a religious medal but had a pinhole microphone and a 20-hour battery, and to try to get Lucas to admit the forgeries on tape, ideally in front of multiple witnesses. Inspector Cross demonstrated how to activate it by pressing the tiny cross. The device vibrated once for record, twice for stop. They also asked me to continue playing the confused old woman, to let Lucas grow desperate enough to make mistakes. I practiced the recording necklace in the bathroom mirror, testing the range. Walter provided me with a burner phone and a contact number for his assistant, a young man named Daniel, who would monitor the audio feed from a van parked 2 blocks away. The plan was to gather enough recorded evidence to support a warrant, and then stage a controlled signature event where Lucas would be arrested in the act of presenting the forged document for ratification. The tension in that week felt like the air before a storm. The maximum cruelty beat, the moment that extinguished every last flicker of maternal love, came when I staged a medical collapse to see what my son would do. Inspector Cross had supplied a simple plan. I would skip both breakfast and my morning water to induce lightheadedness, then dramatize a sudden fainting spell in the hallway at a time, when Lucas and Bianca were urgently preparing for a meeting with a potential bridge investor, who might cover the Red Tree balloon payment until the escrow released. That morning, Lucas was in a panic because the bank had just upped their demand. They needed me to sign a jurat, a sworn notarized statement, confirming that I had voluntarily dissolved the company, and they wanted a videotaped acknowledgement at the bank itself. I heard him through the wall, yelling at Bianca. "I'll get the old woman to sign, she'll do whatever I say. She's basically a vegetable in there." At 11 sharp, I walked into the living room wearing my blue bathrobe, shuffled toward the hallway, and then allowed my knees to buckle. I slammed hard onto the hardwood floor, the impact jarring my hip and shoulder, my body going limp with my eyes slightly open, just enough to see. I saw Lucas glance at me, his expression shifting from annoyance to irritation. Bianca said, "Great, we're late. The meet is in 20 minutes. Lucas stepped over my body, the toe of his polished Oxford grazing my ribs so casually that it could have been an accident except he didn't pause. "She faints all the time, it's probably her blood sugar. I'll text the maid to deal with her. Let's go." And they walked out, the front door clicking shut with a finality that echoed through my bones. I lay there on the cold floor for 16 minutes, counting the ticks of the hallway clock, until Rosa the maid found me. She gasped and knelt beside me, and I whispered that I was okay, just help me to the couch. She brought me a glass of orange juice and her hand trembled. That was the last crack of my heart for that boy. He had become a stranger wearing my son's face, and the boy I'd raised, who once clung to my leg at kindergarten drop-off, was gone. 3 days later, the trap closed. Lucas and Bianca dressed me in a blue cardigan Bianca said looked trustworthy, and drove me to First Federal Bank's regional office in the Audi, the leather seats heated against the spring chill. I wore the recording necklace, activated with a squeeze before we left, and a brooch that looked like a vintage cameo but held a tiny pinhole camera that transmitted to Daniel's van. Walter and Inspector Cross were already in the bank, waiting in a conference room adjacent to the notary's office, watching the live video feed and listening to the audio. The notary, A prim woman named MS, Kellogg with half-moon glasses, sat us in a glass-walled room with a polished mahogany table. Lucas slid the ratification document across the table, a 2-page document with a notary certificate attached. The top page was a single paragraph claiming I acknowledged the dissolution as my free act and deed, and forever waived any claims against Lucas Tackle Holdings. Below were signature blocks for me and a notary certificate with a blank for MS Kellogg's stamp. Bianca handed me a heavy rollerball pen and smiled with too much teeth. Lucas's tone was syrupy. "Just sign right here, Mom, right on the line, and the whole mess is over. The $500,000 will release tomorrow, and you'll never have to worry about bills again. We'll take you to the beach. Remember how you used to love the Gulf?" I looked at the paper, then up at his face, my vision suddenly as sharp as the day I graduated nursing school. I said, calm and clear, "I will not sign away what I built with my own hands, not for you. Not ever." Lucas's mask fell, and something ugly twisted his features. He leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss. "You crazy old woman, sign it or I swear you'll regret it for whatever time you've got left. Do you understand me? Sign the damn paper, or I'll make sure you end up in a state facility where they'll medicate you into a drooling mess." In that exact second, the door opened without a knock. Walter strode in first, his suit jacket unbuttoned, followed by Inspector Cross in a gray suit with his badge clipped to his belt and 2 uniformed bank security officers. Cross's voice was level. "Lucas Elmore, you are under arrest for mail fraud, identity theft, and forgery. Place your hands on the table." Lucas's face went white. Bianca screamed that this was a misunderstanding, that I had memory problems, and started filming with her phone until a security officer gently took it from her, saying it was evidence. Lucas tried to push past me to the door, shouldering past the chair, but the officers had him restrained against the glass wall in seconds, his Oxfords sliding on the floor. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting tight was the sweetest note I've ever heard, a crisp double-click that Thomas would have appreciated. Walter quietly slid a folder toward me that contained the updated trust documents naming me sole beneficial owner of all company IP, plus a letter from Ridge Line's general counsel stating they would immediately reissue the purchase order to me personally, at the full $590,000, once I filed a simple novation changing the payee. The aftermath was a cascade of concrete consequences that unfolded over months. Lucas's trial lasted 6 days in federal district court, the courtroom smelling of old wood and floor wax. The prosecution entered over 40 exhibits. The forged dissolution with handwriting analysis comparing it to genuine signatures. The red tree loan application bearing my faked signature. The audio recording of him telling his investor he could get the old woman to sign anything with the necklace. And the hallway audio of him stepping over my body and showing zero concern, which the jury heard with grim faces. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. He was convicted on 3 federal counts. 1 count of mail fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1341, 1 count of aggravated identity theft, and 1 count of perjury in connection with a financial document. The judge, a woman named Honorable Diane Torres, said from the bench, "The level of callousness toward your own mother is breathtaking." She sentenced him to 5 years in federal prison, of which he served 27 months at a low-security facility, followed by 3 years of supervised release with stringent conditions, including no contact with me outside of monitored employment and mandatory financial counseling. The court ordered restitution in the amount of $203,800, covering the forged loan plus the $3,800 he'd left in that tackle box as a mockery, with interest accruing at the federal rate. All his personal assets, his truck, his share of the marital home, his bank accounts, were seized and liquidated by the U.S. Marshals. Bianca divorced him the week after conviction, filing electronically from a new condo, and posted a tearful 15-minute video about betrayal that amassed 3 million views, though she deleted it when my attorney sent a cease and desist noting she'd been complicit in the fraud and could face charges herself. She later settled a civil fraud case with me for a nominal sum and agreed to never post about me again. Ridge Line Outfitters, upon learning the full saga, didn't back away. Their CEO, a woman named Karen Delaney, called me personally 2 days after the arrest and said her legal team had briefed her, and she wanted to rebrand the entire line under a new banner I would choose. She flew to Texas and met me at a cafe by the lake, where we sketched out a plan on napkins. I renegotiated the contract to include a long-term supply deal at 70% higher royalty rates, because now the brand carried a story that outdoorsmen couldn't resist, a tale of integrity and comeback. I renamed the company Lure of Betrayal Tackle, filed the paperwork with the state, and had a new logo designed featuring a cracked lure with a hook shaped like a question mark. The first shipment went out 6 months after Lucas's conviction, with a redesigned packaging insert that tells a short version of this story and prints his official federal criminal docket number, USAV. Lucas Elmore, case no. 2, 21 CR 00145, in bold red ink on every box, right above the barcode. Anglers started collecting them. I've seen photos online of guys displaying the boxes on their tackle room walls like trophies. Now comes the part that sometimes feels like a fever dream. As a condition of his supervised release, Lucas was required to maintain verifiable employment approved by his probation officer, with a certain number of hours per week in a role that didn't involve control over finances. I offered him a job that satisfied his restitution order and his work requirement, and the court approved it after a hearing where I stated my terms on the record. Every weekday morning at 7:30, he arrives at my lure workshop, a converted industrial space north of town that smells of cedar shavings and powder paint, his ankle monitor visible under his jeans. He wears a bright orange safety vest with "Hooked on Lies" screen printed across the back in reflective silver, and he spends 8 hours at a stool in the back room, tying stainless steel spinner wire to clevises with a tiny eyelet tool, assembling the very lures that now bear my name. His wages are garnished before he even sees a paycheck, funneled directly toward his court-ordered debt, and the payroll service sends me a monthly report. He's not allowed to interact with customers, handle the books, or even use the office computer. He eats a brown bag lunch alone at a table under a sign that says, "Integrity is not optional." When the probation officer makes a surprise visit, which happens every few weeks, his compliance sheet gets another green mark. He once asked me, with his eyes to the floor, why I'm doing this, and I said, "Because you need to see, every single day, what you tried to steal and who you stole it from. Every lure that ships is a receipt." My grandson Leo, now 8, visits after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He helps me test new poppers at the retention pond behind the shop, his casts getting farther each month. He knows the whole story, told in bits over blueberry popsicles, and he once asked me why his dad wears that vest. I said, "Because some promises come due later than we expect, but they always come due. And because integrity isn't just about what you say, it's about what you do when you think nobody's watching." Leo nodded solemnly, then hooked a small base and reeled it in with a grin. He doesn't see Lucas often, and Lucas isn't allowed to speak to him during work hours. When Leo waves, Lucas sometimes lifts his head, but the glare from the overhead lights makes his face hard to read. Thomas, my lock-picking, dead man's switch architect of a husband, had always said that a properly built lock doesn't just keep bad people out. It forces them to reveal themselves when they try to break it. He also said that the best locks aren't made of steel. They're made of laws and careful planning, and that love often means putting a door between yourself and those who would harm you. I now run a company built on integrity, employing my own betrayer in a cage of his own making, and I still carry that hollow cedar lure in my handbag, its threaded nose cone always tight, its secret compartment empty now, except for a small photo of Thomas smiling in his workshop. It's a memento of the day I learned that the truest key to a locked door isn't a tension wrench or a hook pick. It's patience, clear eyes, and a mother's willingness to finally see her child for who they really are. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments. If you believe that the truth can set you free, and that sometimes the best revenge is a well-notarized contract, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of justice served cold. Until next time, keep your lines tight and your trust tighter.